Hello and welcome to another episode of the Iraqi Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host as always. Before we start today's episode, I just want to briefly apologize for the lack of podcast episodes lately, but we're starting off 2019 with a great episode. So today I brought back Dr. Shawn Arent to talk about nutrient timing. Shawn, great to have you back. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Juma. It's always nice to be on your show.
Thank you so much. So before we start today's episode, I just want to briefly mention that this podcast is available on YouTube, but you can also find it on SoundCloud, Stitcher, and iTunes as well. So today's topic, great topic as always. There's a lot of discussions around this topic, so hopefully we'll be able to maybe come to a I don't want to say conclusion, but maybe clear up some misunderstanding regarding this topic. And I know you've recently had a publication related to protein timing, so it will be interesting discussing that. Let's start with briefly describing what we mean by nutrient timing in the sense what we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, I think probably the simplest way to define it is, taking in precise, and I use the word precise fairly loosely, right? So it's not like to the exact gram, but, precise and specific nutrients in and around specific times, So, and I know that's overly broad, but it's meant to, if we look at the history of nutrient timing, it used to be thought that basically it was what you took in during your workout is what mattered, right? So it's the during part. And then we started to realize, oh, you know what, though? And a lot of it was the John Ivy stuff with the anabolic window. Oh, maybe it matters what you take in after. You only have this small window. Well, we now know that window is a heck of a lot bigger, all right? But there is an increase in anabolic activity. So then it went, what are you eating during and what are you eating after? And then we started to go, oh, you know what you eat before matters too. So you had this sort of peri-workout period, right? So from beginning to end and sort of all points in between. And now if you really look at how nutrient timing has progressed, and in my opinion, in a good way, is the whole day matters, right? So in other words, it's timing throughout the day around your training, around your sleep, and things like that. So I don't think we don't want to lose that in the mix, is that we're not just talking about like one specific period of time, but it's kind of throughout the day. But generally speaking, when we start talking about performance in particular, that timing in and around the workout is really what we tend to, I guess, really think of as the nutrient timing, frame, if you will, to try to capture as much of that clock as possible.
Excellent. Now, there seems to be people are constantly discussing about some population where this might be more important than for other population. Would you say that in general it's important for everyone, or should some people be more specific or more aware of when they consume their nutrients?
Yeah, I think there's really some, if we talk about nutrients broadly and we don't just talk about protein, I do think that there's some interesting data on multiple populations, including, overweight and obesity and the timing of food intake, what's eaten for breakfast versus what's eaten later in the day, and things like that I do think that the timing issue can be important throughout populations. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite studies that was done, it even showed that timing within a meal can matter. So in other words, if you eat your carbohydrate, at the beginning of the meal, then to your fats and proteins, you actually had more of an insulin response than if you ate your fats and your proteins first, followed by your carbohydrates. So when we start talking about nutrient timing, even within a meal, it can actually potentially matter. So I thought that was pretty cool. But I think, if I had to pick a population, obviously it's one I work quite a bit with and that we study quite a bit. I think athletes have, sort of one of those worlds where nutrient timing may be more important than others. Not that the others don't matter, and I don't want to dismiss that. And certainly there's a role for timing even throughout the day in terms of the way you space your meals and things like that can make small differences. The catch is with athletes, small differences can mean big differences, right? So if you're talking about, the 2016 Olympics, realize that the difference between the gold medal and the silver medal in the marathon was 1% when you look at time. So those small differences can add up. And, those are things that we have to think about. So I would say, of all populations, again, being one that I work around quite a bit, the athletic population, especially, at high level and above, becomes important. But I would say that the concept of timing has a role across the board. I don't want to get caught up in the minutia with some people. At the end of the day, your overall diet is going to matter more than just when you ate the foods. But at the end of the day, if you get that other stuff straight, then the timing can play a potentially bigger role.
Yeah, and I also think that the problems that seem to be today is that we went from one extreme to the other. So before it was more like, well, if you didn't consume nutrients right after your workout, your workout was basically wasted. And now it's at the other end where people are saying, it's almost like people are saying that if you do take a protein shake after training, it's detrimental to your results.
Yeah, I think the part that's what worried me the most about this whole sort of trend that we've seen with this. And so it's kind of a perfect example of how research findings and review findings kind of got bastardized, right? So it's like, basically if you look at some of the meta-analyses on this and they say, oh, the protein timing didn't matter, right? So if you ate right after your workout or didn't, wasn't a big deal. And I actually saw a strength coach that had posted, it was on Facebook, and his response was, yeah, I knew that was BS. So now I tell my athletes, no, don't eat protein right after your workout because it doesn't do you any good. And I'm like, no. That's not what those findings said. And I think the other part that was missed is in most of those studies that were included in the metas, most of them were in untrained individuals. Mm-hmm. A large majority were in untrained individuals. And they really weren't timing studies, right? So they were just looking at, trying to synthesize the literature in terms of when these feedings happen to take place. But there's only 2 or 3 actual timing studies where they manipulate when the food is given and compare it to the other outcomes. So I think we have to be a little bit careful with that in terms of saying it doesn't matter. But here's the thing. Look, if you don't take in enough protein in a day, just because you happen to eat right after your workout doesn't mean you've salvaged the whole day, right? So you still need to, the most important part is going to be your total protein intake in a day. But if you nail that part, then when you take it in, and we know from a refractory period standpoint, from a repeat stimulation of multiple protein synthesis and whole body protein synthesis, that roughly every 3 hours or so, you have a unique opportunity to kind of re-peak muscle protein synthesis, regardless of amino acid availability in the blood. So I think, when we look at it from that standpoint, you're right. It did take this massive shift to the other way where it was kind of like, we were so wrong on the other end. Now don't eat after your workout. And that's really not the take home at all. It's just one of those things where if you left the gym and you forgot your shake at home and you get home and you eat an hour later, you're still okay. But there's really no advantage to not eating. The only advantage to not eating after a workout is the stuff that's been done on carbohydrate restriction and looking at mitochondrial growth and mitochondrial reticular growth. And so there's been some studies that James E. Morton and his group and others have done a really nice job with in terms of restricting carbs after a high intensity workout and not refeeding until after the next sort of moderate intensity workout and its effects. But the interesting thing is those have been somewhat inconsistent in terms of performance benefits, which for an athlete is the most important part. And funny enough, the ones that seem to have the most consistency when it came to performance outcomes fed protein before the next workout, just not carbohydrates. So in other words, it wasn't fasted per se, it was just carb restricted. So that would be the only example of where, not eating a particular type of food prior to a workout from a restriction standpoint might have a nutrient timing value. But from a protein standpoint, I think, and even in the paper that we had come out last September, really our take home message was there's no advantage to waiting. So in other words, you don't have to, go overboard with, you put that last weight down on your last set and man, you're pounding that protein shake because you got to hit that anabolic window. It's not that, but at the same time, there's no advantage to not eating as soon as possible. And I will tell you this, when you work with athletes who may train multiple times a day, train for 2 or 3 hours, 4 hours at a time, train every day, whatever it is, you really can't afford to wait, because you're trying to take advantage of as much of that window as possible. And I think the thing that sort of perplexed me that I don't quite understand why it's gone this direction is when you start to look at, taking in food or not, really the idea was, look, okay, it turns out that this anabolic window is more like a giant garage door, that we've got way more time to do this than possible. So don't worry about it. Eat whenever, right? Like, it's still going to work. See, I look at it a little bit differently, where I look at it and go, okay, so if my anabolic window is that much bigger, why would I not fit as many feedings in there as possible, right? Why not try to make sure that my protein intake, my carbohydrate intake, all of those things above actually are, squeezed into that window as much as possible to maximize the anabolic effects. To me, it's more of a reason to eat than a reason not to, because you can take advantage of something. And I think that's fine. And that's a fine message. And again, when it comes to athletes, we work with college athletes a lot. And I know for some of the European listeners, they're not as familiar with like our college sport structure, but think of it like sort of a Division II or Division III professional level, the way we tend to treat it, especially here at Rutgers in the conference we're in. And the thing is, these kids will train and then they're off to classes, right? So if they don't take in something right after training in the form of protein and carbohydrate, it might be another 3, 4, 5 hours before they eat, because they're off to class. They don't have time to stop and get something to eat, whatever it is. If that's the case, now we're jeopardizing tomorrow's training session. And then when we're playing 2 games in a week, we're jeopardizing performance in each of those matches. Because now, as soon as, like, if we play like a Friday, Sunday schedule, and we're playing Friday night and Sunday afternoon, as soon as I'm done Friday night, I got to start getting on the ball with feeding these kids, because we got to repeat again on Sunday, and especially when you work with female athletes who it looks like take longer to carbohydrate replenish. I don't have a whole lot of time to play with in terms of trying to make sure they're ready to go, 2 days later. So I think that how we've sort of approached this nutrient timing thing, I think, again, we need to look at it as an opportunity rather than an excuse, in terms of, I don't have to do this. No, you don't, but really, why wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a great point you mentioned there with not really understand, because there's a big difference when working with athletes that train multiple times a day. And like you say, you can't really afford to wait 2 hours if your next training session is in like 5 or 6 hours. You just have to maximize the time, especially if you're doing a lot of endurance training. You need to replenish carbohydrate storage. But in regards to resistance training, would there be a difference between if you were like a novice lifter compared to an advanced lifter? Would it be more important for someone that's more advanced, that maybe MPS is not as long as someone who's a novice lifter?
Yeah, and it may not even be so much that MPS isn't as long. I think it becomes a question of the most powerful stimulus in the whole equation, right? So resistance training by itself is a highly anabolic stimulus. Yes, it creates a catabolic environment, right? There's breakdown, there's restructuring, but what it's doing is it's promoting remodeling. Okay, so by itself, it's a very profound stressor that does a lot. So if you take a novice individual and you ask me, timing of protein intake or intensity of the workout, which one's more important? The workout, like that's going to drive it. When you start looking at a more advanced individual where, you're not getting these larger gains in strength and hypertrophy because you've kind of started to hit that plateauing effect, right? There's a genetic limitation or whatever it is. Now protein timing might start to play a little bit bigger role because you're trying to maximize those small advantages in order to get the most out of it. So arguably in that case, the more advanced individual would probably have more to gain from it. When you're working with a novice, somebody who's just starting out, we've got a couple studies like this where we used, even for a weight loss study we had done. And, at the end of the day, when you're just starting somebody out on an exercise program, the exercise and the diet are the big stimuli, more so than any supplement. Same thing would apply when you start looking at the overall intake. Look, if somebody's starting a new weight training program, right? So if we are considering like a novice to intermediate or whatever, total protein intake is going to be really important. Timing, probably less so, except we would want them to try to spread it out throughout the day. I think Paul Arciero and others have good data on that protein pacing type of idea, regardless of the population. But when you start looking at a more advanced lifter, we do want to take care of, make sure you have enough protein in the day, like the total intake, but then getting it in and around your training may be equally as important to some degree. Obviously, it doesn't supersede the quantity, but timing does start to play a little bit more of a factor because now you can manipulate the smaller variables. And whether that's a pre or a post, and it's funny because we even see that like pre-feeding may have as much of an impact as post-feeding, right? So if you take in protein before, I think Brad Schoenfeld had a good study on this. If you eat before versus eat after, they're kind of equivalent in terms of MPS, in terms of growth and all that stuff. I would argue it this way. Why not do both? So if it's like an hour before training and then you eat within an hour after and your training lasted an hour and a half to 2 hours, you've got about a 3-hour window. So I eat before and after, because I'm hungry, so it makes sense. And I think the other thing that gets lost too is if we're trying to hit these, 1.6, 1.8, even 2.2 grams per kilogram protein intake in a day, when you start working with larger athletes, if I don't eat more frequently, that is a hard goal to hit in just 3 meals. So the way I look at it is feeding after your workout is just one more opportunity to make sure you hit your total daily protein intake, right? It's a convenience factor that adds into the whole equation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that you mentioned that was really good is people are maybe more so concerned with this protein shake after training without considering the total amounts first.
Right.
But that's the thing that I felt with some of these studies that came out, that what they actually were trying to communicate was, don't be so obsessed with that protein shake. You have to focus more on the total first. But if you got that covered, the next step would be naturally to focus more on the post-workout nutrition. But I think where it got lost was it doesn't ever. But this is not only related to nutrition. You see this trend also with training. A new study comes out and people say this doesn't matter anymore. Personal preference. Blah 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 blah. And the thing is, when like 90% of my clients are high-level athletes, and they frequently ask me these questions. And I'm like, well, for the general population, it doesn't really matter that much, but you're not in that general population. We're trying to like optimize things so you can perform better, and that's where these small changes really start to add up over time.
I agree, and you used the key word for me, which is optimize. I think it's to me, there is a big difference between sufficient and optimal. And I think too often, sort of the recommendations we come along with based on some of these studies where, talking about the protein timing, the protein intake it's sufficient. I want optimal. So, if we're trying to take that extreme where it's like, hey, even these smaller changes can make a difference. The protein thing is sort of like a cake, right? So if you don't bake the whole cake first, you're just eating the icing out of a cup, right? Like you haven't put the icing on the cake. Well, to me, your total daily protein intake is the cake. Mm-hmm. Once you nail that, and now you work on the timing, that's the icing. And now that cake tastes better because you got the icing on the cake, right? So I think you have to take care of the big picture first, and then you start to add in the other things, which also includes what else you're eating at other times of the day, maybe what you're eating before you go to bed, how it's kind of like the breakfast question. Okay. So, is breakfast the most important meal of the day? Well, I mean, if you define breakfast as the first meal you eat after sleeping, then yes, it is, because at some point you have to eat, right? So it's kind of critical. But, when you say, breakfast doesn't really make a big difference for weight loss, there are some studies that show it does. But in my world and in yours, where we're talking about working with athletes, there is some really interesting data showing that athletes that skip breakfast still perform worse later in the day. Mm-hmm. Right. So even if you're like an afternoon and evening training athlete, or you have a game that night, breakfast actually matters. So now we're in sort of the wide world. We're talking about, do you have to? No, you don't have to do anything. Right. But at the end of the day, it's when you start working with certain populations, it's like, look, if you really want to maximize performance and these outcomes, you do want to eat it. Okay. If you don't like breakfast in your general population, you're trying to lose some weight, can you afford to eat later? Yeah, sure. You can do that. Let me turn the light on. Hold on. Light timers. Anyway, so the, I think the way that comes across, it's all in context, right? And if you're taking somebody who you can barely get to work out on a regular basis and who you're trying to just simply teach the difference between a carb, a fat, and a protein, and trying to teach what a quality protein is, and sources of fiber and sort of your high energy versus low energy carbs, and you're trying to teach those basics. If you now all of a sudden throw on like little timing minutia, you're going to boggle their mind, right? Because we're still like, we need you to exercise and we need you to just focus on the kinds of things you're eating. Cool, good. Okay, now let's work on the timing. So I think it's a staging process, but honestly, with an athlete and the populations you work with in particular, if I don't emphasize the need to eat after they train, I'm kind of bad at what I do. I'm doing them a disservice from a recovery standpoint. And even if we take MPS out of the equation, which has been the big driver in all this, right? It's muscle protein synthesis. Hey, there's enzyme function, there's immune function, there's carbohydrate replenishment in the form of glycogen, yada, yada. There's other things that timing contributes to beyond just how big are your muscles. And that's the part we need to recognize. And that's actually the big point of our review. The paper we had come out in Frontiers is really focusing. We also include endurance sports. Most other areas, reviews in this topic have not looked at that. Protein intake for endurance athletes matters too. It's been shown to impact overall immune function. It's been shown to impact recovery across the course of a week with those longer days and muscle soreness. So even for those athletes who are often ignored in this equation, because we're just like, how do you get big muscles? The runners matter too, and so all athletes matter. So I think that's something that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, great that you brought that up, because one of the follow-up questions was differences between what you should recommend for an endurance athlete compared to a power athlete or someone doing resistance training. And protein, there might be similarities, but carbohydrate is probably where the biggest difference is. What would you say would be a good recommendations for, like, if we were to compare them, what would you say differences in requirements would be?
I think protein, you're right. Across the board, it's pretty similar, somewhere between that 1.6 to 2.2. Can you do more than that? Sure, whatever. But that's sort of a sweet spot, right? That should hit your requirements for the day, maximize recovery in its own capacity and stuff. If you're looking to massively change body composition, I think Joey Antonio's work has shown that even higher protein intakes can help with that, especially if you're replacing carbohydrate with it. In terms of carbs, though, I think one thing to recognize is depending on the level of endurance athlete you're working with, and so we work a lot with power endurance athletes. You and I have talked about this before. I deal a lot with soccer or football, since you're over in Europe, obviously. I think the thing that we realize is that's a power endurance sport, and it is very glycogen depleted. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's classic work by Bengt Saltine going back to the 70s where they've shown up to almost a 95 to 97% depletion in glycogen during a soccer match. Like that's insane. Resistance training doesn't do that. Yes, it is highly reliant on carbohydrate for fuel, but an hour and a half lifting session, you're probably looking at maybe a 50% depletion at most. So the amount of carbohydrate to recover from that is going to be a little bit less than like a triathlete, a cyclist, a runner, a soccer player, a football player. So I think putting that in context, I think, is important. Now, one of the challenges that we have, ideally, if we're looking at recovery capabilities, taking in about 1.2 grams per kilogram every hour in terms of carbohydrate after a match for the next 3 to 4 hours seems to satisfy those requirements to a great degree. The one thing I will tell you, having worked with female athletes, is it is very hard to get them to take in that much, all right? Because in their mind, there's still a calorie issue to this. Where protein becomes important is we know that for the most part, adding carbohydrate to protein doesn't really do much to MPS, all right? It doesn't really matter much in the muscle protein synthesis side. However, if your carbohydrate intake is under 1.2 grams per kilogram for that post-training, post-match intake, adding protein does help with glycogen resynthesis. So even if they're taking in a little less carbohydrate, having protein at the same time can help shrink that gap and actually still enhance glycogen replenishment. So I think that's important too, and it gives us an opportunity to fit the feedings. And if you have an athlete who you're trying to weight maintain over a course of a season, those are things to keep in mind. You can use it that way. And then, again, just in terms of how we present it and what an athlete might be thinking in terms of food quantity. Mixing the two is important, but certainly, when you start looking at those endurance athletes, if you're performing at the high end of intensity with on the aerobic side of things, you need carbs for fuel. And and I know keto and its popularity and this and that. Honestly, from a performance standpoint, just say no. There's just no evidence that it works. Almost, at best in any given study, it's been as good. But most studies, it's worse. And here's the thing. The only time it's been as good is after they went through a 3 or 4 month transition period for adaptation. Well, now I've just traded 3 or 4 months of training. That doesn't make any sense to just be as good. But for general population, if they choose to go the keto route, just realize that your high intensity aerobic efforts are going to be sacrificed a bit. But when you're working with an athlete who on that aerobic side needs carbs for fuel, then that means that we need to eat carbs for fuel in order to do that as well. So yes, their requirements are going to be higher, but it presents a unique opportunity from a dietary intervention standpoint. And, I am a big fan of nutrient periodization. In terms of in your highest training volumes, take in more of the carbohydrate. On your lower volumes, you don't, right? So you cycle it based on your needs. And I think that people need to realize that sort of being anti-keto for athletes doesn't by default make you high carb, right? I think there are high carb days and there are lower carb days. The bottom line is you manipulate carbohydrate intake based on the needs of the fueling of the athlete. It seems like a cop out, but it's the reality. It's like, how much carb do you take in? It depends on your training, but for most people that are just doing weightlifting and stuff like that, you don't have to become obsessed with it. You don't need a ton of carbohydrate after your lift because, to tell you the truth, you probably didn't deplete it that much. And if you did, you're probably going to get plenty in the next meal. That being said, if you want some carb with your protein, knock yourself out. That's not a bad idea. You just don't have to overdo it. You don't need 80 or 100 grams per se.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a couple of things here. I think, first off, people need to realize how big of a difference there actually is. And I know a lot of people say they train hard, but there's actually this study you're familiar with it, the TESH study from '86, where they did 20 sets to failure, and then they measured glycogen, and they were like 20 to 40% glycogen depleted in the quads.
Right.
Nobody trains like that, and still they didn't deplete that much. But back to the saltine study, I think the saltine from '73, where you mentioned they depleted almost all of it. And
almost all. Yeah,
and just look how shitty they performed. I think the depleted group walked 50% of the time, while the other group, and really, you really see the difference between the first half and the second half. How performance really drops as soon as the glycogen is depleted. And regarding the keto stuff that you mentioned, it's a good thing that you mentioned that, because I don't think people realize that when research shows, people sometimes think that it's performing as well. It's just showing that in some cases there doesn't seem to be a difference. And usually there's been these sports where you're not really working at the highest intensities.
Or for extended periods of time. So like gymnastics, right? So if you're trading some weight, but even that wasn't a true keto study as much as it was a low carb, high fat, high protein. So most of the studies that have actually shown a benefit or a non-negative effect to it typically weren't really keto as much as they were high fat, high protein. A true ketogenic diet is not high protein. But we've kind of modified it in the fitness world to fit that umbrella, and that's fine. And look, there are studies that have shown some health benefits to ketogenic diets. I also think that many health benefits are very overstated based on what the research shows. There's no evidence that it kills cancer, tumors, or all those things, at least not in humans. And so I think we have to be careful with how we do that. It works for some people because it forces them to pay attention to what they're eating, and it allows them to potentially lose weight a little quicker up front. Maybe that encourages them, they stick with it. But it's also been shown to be one of the hardest diets to adhere to. And at the end of the day, the most successful diets are the ones that you can actually do. Because face it, you do a ketogenic diet, like, this sucks, I can't do this for forever. You kick off it, and all of a sudden you regain the weight. And I think the other thing that people need to realize is when we talk about sort of the fitness and health side, we tend to talk about diet and exercise, right? Athletes eat and train. There's a difference. We don't diet and exercise, we eat and train. And so if we take that mentality, we're again back to that optimization idea, in terms of trying to get the most out of this. And I think that, again, when you look at the work that, in soccer, football, the work Mark Russell's done on halftime feedings and stuff, like there's some really good stuff there about how to prolong performance. If you look at some of the stuff in the endurance world that Trent Stellingwerff has done, there's more and more evidence for how these fuels really impact us. And if you're a serious athlete, you need to pay attention to what you're eating and when. And it's funny, even with the whole, sort of since we went off on this tangent, sorry about that. But even like the whole macros stuff, right? Look, I'm not like anti-sugar. As a matter of fact, I think for athletes in some cases from a refueling standpoint, like it's a good idea, right? There's sugar gets in faster. But the reality is there's plenty of studies that actually show that food quality, when you look at amylopectin content, when you look at amylin and you look at the fiber content and things like that, like it changes absorption rates, and absorption rates change how its metabolizable energy gets utilized. So and you can't sit here and have somebody tell me that somehow a protein source matters, but carbohydrate doesn't. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. And so how we absorb these things matters. So I do think that food quality is something to look at. And so you take your higher energy, faster metabolizing fuels in and around your training and your slower ones outside of that, and now you maximize how we adapt metabolically and hormonally. And, do we have to get overly caught up in this? No, I think some of it is intuitive if you just pay attention to what you're doing. But certainly when you start getting into the athlete world, there are days, we've got players, we got some really cool data, and this has been sort of replicated in some other studies, but, we have players that in an overtime match burn as much as 2,500 calories. At that point, after the match, I want them to eat well. I want them to eat good food, but I also want them to eat. Right? It's just like we need calories, we need replenishment. You want a piece of pizza, we can have that later. It's like one of those where you're trying to get fuels in them, you don't want them eating salads. So I think that those are things that we try to take into account, and I think we're on the same page in terms of the way. It's not that the research is bad. It's not that it's wrong. I think it's been the way that it's been applied and interpreted, and it's almost created this excuse more than anything else. And again, it's back to that sufficient versus optimal issue, and it's an important distinction. There's a lot of things you can do lifting wise. There are certain things that maybe work a little bit better. I would want to focus on those. Doesn't mean you can't do the other types of workouts. Might be a personal preference issue, but I do think if you want to optimize what you're doing, you try to pay attention to the details.
Exactly, and a great point regarding that is looking at protein dosage studies where they conclude 20 grams is sufficient, but if you look at the graphs in the Moore study, the Wittert study, 40 grams is actually better than 20, but it's not that big of a difference that they can say that it's statistically different and that they can recommend that. But generally, it wouldn't really matter to most people. But for an athlete, I would say that matters, increasing it to 40 compared to 20.
Well, and by the way, let's not forget that these acute MPS studies don't always translate to what happens long term. So now there's a whole nother twist to add into this in terms of how it works. And the other thing I would say too is, what I find interesting about these like 20 versus 40 studies is the conclusion that came out of the 20 versus 40 using whole body exercise was that 40 was better than 20. Not a lot, but the way it was phrased was that 40 grams maximizes MPS compared to 20 with this. So my question is, how did it compare to 60? That's right, there wasn't a 60-gram dose. So we don't know that 40 grams maximized it. We know that 40 grams was better than 20. And if you start to take these larger athletes, and when we're doing whole body exercise, but it's a vastus lateralis biopsy, while I do know that should reflect protein metabolism, certainly there's a whole body effect too. And so I think we need to be careful how we interpret some of the biopsy effects alone. Not that this was bad research. I actually think that, I think Kevin Tipton, Stu Phillips, and those guys, like, they should be commended for the type of work they're doing and the quality of the work. But we also have to realize that there's limitations on interpretation, that we just have to be careful how we use that going forward. And, oh, by the way, pay attention to the population that it's applying to. And the reality is, 20, 40, 60, whatever, at the end of the day, protein goes to more than just MPS. Right. So the whole body protein synthesis factor does matter, as well as what happens to breakdown. So I don't think that we can put a cap on it per se. I think if nothing else, we're pretty safe in saying somewhere between 20 to 40 grams should get it done. That's a safe bet. I would tend to err on the more than 40, but I'm, almost 100 kilos. So I'm going to try to gravitate towards a little more than a little less. Because to tell you the truth, if I don't, I'm not going to get all my protein in a day. And I think that's the reality. I always find it funny if you do the math. Let's say that you have a 100-kilo athlete. And so we would say, okay, we want, roughly, if you're talking 2 grams per kilo, right? So we're saying, okay, we want 200 grams of protein that day. So doing the math, if all I need is 20 grams per dose, right? 20 grams per feeding. And that maximizes it. Do I have to eat 10 times a day? Because now I got a problem to get to 200. So it's like, you only need 20 grams, but you just told me I need 200 in a whole day. So that means that each meal has to work better if I take in more than that 20. Otherwise, what do I do? 10, 20, 20, 20, 20, eat all the rest. Right. So now it's just like one big bolus. So I think there's a math factor that gets lost in that too, in terms of understanding that when you have these athletes that have to take in 160, 180, 200, 220 grams of protein in a day, if we just tell them all you need is 20 grams per serving, they're going to be eating every hour. And I'm a fan of that. I actually could probably eat every hour. I like protein, so it'd be fine. But I think there's a practicality issue that got lost in that somewhere, and I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, when I lecture in sports nutrition for Academy for Personal Training in Norway, and when I do the protein lecture, I always tell them that first you calculate the total amount of protein, and then finding out how many meals you need by the day, you divide it and make sure that every meal is between 20 and 40 grams. I also add in another rule, and that is that 2/3 of the 20 to 40 grams should come from a complete source, because one of the pitfalls with athletes when they consume a lot of carbohydrates is that it's a lot of protein coming from the carb sources.
But it's not a complete protein, so you do have to eat more in that case. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if you
I think that's a great recommendation.
Yeah, so if you eat 150 grams of oats, you have 20 grams there, and then what do? Just add in a little bit of that's not going to be optimal. So I think you're right. The math doesn't add up with a lot of these recommendations that people give, and it really all makes sense if you just think about it, how you should structure it.
Yeah, and I think from a science standpoint and from a proof of concept standpoint, I think it's all very useful. But then we also have to figure out, how does that then translate in terms of what we do with it? And I think that that's where, using a bit of common sense and doing the math on it and saying, okay, then, if we need this amount per meal, then this would, the other one that always interests me too is even the meal frequency issue, right? Because generally speaking, you look at most of the stuff that's coming out, meal frequency doesn't matter. What's really interesting is if you ever get a chance, if you look at the meta that was done on the meal frequency, there were a couple outlier studies. And so what they did is they removed those, right? So then meal frequency mattered when those were in, but they were largely influencing the effects. So then they were considered outliers and they were removed. Those studies that were removed as outliers had one big thing in common compared to all the other studies. They included exercise. So now the question is, does meal frequency matter when you're exercising? Versus a study that was simply a weight loss study where it's an energy balance issue and exercise isn't part of the equation. So now we've got a whole nother contextual variable that we need to start thinking about in terms of how frequency impacts. And could that have to do with the recovery from exercise, the muscle protein synthesis, the meal feedings, and the timing? So now all of a sudden, maybe nutrient timing actually did matter. But again, we don't necessarily have the answers to all these things, but I think there's enough information out there to make us question it and say, hey, these are some areas to look at. And that's one of my favorite things about meta-analyses is not the actual conclusions. It's identifying where the holes in the literature still are. So if you look at the nutrient timing meta, really one of the biggest holes that it has the ability to identify is there's not a lot of timing studies. So that's an area that we need to think about. When you look at the meal frequency, tell you what, there weren't a lot of studies using exercise along with that. Maybe that's the sweet spot. So again, I think it opens up some avenues and helps to direct our research resources. And I think that's a real positive in terms of moving forward. And that's why, I'm not by no, for any of the listeners, I don't want you to think I'm negative on metas. I've done them. I'm just saying that I think we have to be careful how we use them. And rather than try to think we're coming to definitive conclusions, I think what it does is it may help us focus our efforts on what still needs to be researched.
Great point. And I totally agree with that. Let's move forward with the study that you published last year. So give us a brief on what you actually did in the review and what findings you had in that paper.
Yeah, so we were really focused on recovery and performance as much thing, and so not just MPS. So we were looking at biomarker responses. We were looking at repeated performances in studies that have done it, the day or the day after or a week later. But what we're really focusing on was active individuals. So we basically removed the studies that were using these untrained individuals to sort of remove that bias and say, okay, in people that are now trained, what are the potential performance and recovery benefits to protein intake? And at the end of the day, when you start looking at the higher quality protein sources, most of the milk proteins were fairly equivalent in terms of doing their job. In terms of when synthesis occurred, it may be a difference in terms of rate of absorption and things, but overall they kind of tend to equal out. But what we found was that, taking in protein, post-training, post-game and things like that did actually appear to at least have a small effect on speeding up the recovery process. And for endurance athletes, it had a pretty notable effect on immune function and repeat performance and things like that. So, and especially when combined with carbohydrates. So it looks like there may be a bit of a synergistic effect there, which would make intuitive sense. So really the ultimate conclusion was that total protein intake in the day matters most. Your training matters most. The timing starts to matter after that, and there is no good reason not to eat right after training. So in other words, even if some of the effects were small, they were notable in terms of what it would mean for these athletes. And even in some of the studies that had non-significant findings, if you looked at it from a magnitude of effect standpoint, there is potentially something there for the more highly trained population. So I think the take home was just, there's no reason not to do this. And if anything, the evidence is fairly good to suggest that you should be taking in protein after. And again, it mostly focused on protein. We stayed away from the carbs and fats to a great degree because that wasn't the purpose of it. But it's hard not to bring those in to some degree when there's a couple of studies that have combined them. And when that's the case, it looks like there's a synergistic effect to improve performance and recovery overall. But like I said, the unique aspect was looking at those endurance athletes as well and realizing they need it too.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we've talked about a lot about the peri-workout nutrition, and we also talked a bit about breakfast. But is there other times where there might also be important to consume nutrient and protein in particular during the day?
I think sleep is sort of the next frontier, for multiple reasons. Now here's the interesting thing, because there's also some evidence out there, sort of not in the exercise world per se, looking more at chronobiology and looking at what happens if, because of diurnal variations and what happens to our metabolism in terms of not eating late at night, right, from a weight loss standpoint. But at the same time, I think if you look at some of the work of Luke Van Loon, of Mike Ormsby, and you look at what they've done with these pre-bed feedings, they've been able to show that it didn't have negative effects on metabolism. It didn't cause weight gain. And in most cases, it helped with muscle mass, and I think that's a big thing. So I think it may come down to what your goals are as well. But generally speaking, I think a fairly good recommendation at this point would, especially if you're trying to fit all of your protein feedings in a day and you're trying to hit your protein content for the day, feeding before bed in the form of a slower digesting protein, a casein or something like that, has some notable benefits. I think we even have that in our review, that sleep is sort of that next frontier because there is some intriguing evidence. And especially for an athlete that's now going to have to get up and train again the next day, having something before you go to bed can make intuitive sense in terms of making sure that, think about it, right? Otherwise, you're in a fairly catabolic state for a pretty extended period of time. And if you can provide sort of this sustained infusion of amino acid through what you ate before you went to bed, you have the opportunity to help your overall recovery. So, and like I said, I think the stuff that Luke and Mike have done has been very, very good in that area, and I'm intrigued by it. I think there's still a lot more to be done. But generally speaking, timing wise, I think I'd probably feel more comfortable recommending protein intake before bed than carbohydrate for somebody trying to lose fat mass. For an athlete that may have to get up and train again the next day, carbohydrate before bed might not be a bad idea to top off glycogen stores, especially depending on what they have coming up. And I think I would mention along with that real briefly, is something I forgot to say earlier. When we look at the studies on carb restriction, realize that all of those have been limited to like steady state sports, right? So running and cycling, almost all of them cycling. I would be very cautious about using that with a power endurance sport that requires acceleration, cutting, turning, whatever, because I don't want that athlete in a depleted state unless they just happen to be going out for like a long, slow distance run as part of their conditioning. But like, for example, prior to soccer practice, prior to football practice, prior to hockey or anything like that, I'm not sure I would want them going in a carb restricted state thinking that I'm going to help mitochondrial biogenesis because of what it could lead to for injury risk. So I'd be cautious in that. But for my other endurance athletes, different story. It may have a real role there.
Great point. And I totally agree with that. I don't think people realize the point that you mentioned there, that most of the studies done on these sleep low or train low protocols are on running or cycling. They haven't really been tested out in intermediate sports like hockey and football and things like that. So that's a really good point. So let's wrap up this podcast with a brief take-home message.
I think the brief take-home message is eat, feed the machine. It's the reality is when you start to calculate your needs in a day, identify the big picture first. Don't get caught in the details first. Identify the cake, right? So what's your total protein intake in a day? Identify that, use that. Then you work on the timing. But at the end of the day, train hard, eat enough, get sleep. I think if you do those three things well, you're doing all right. And I think that, when we start to look at the end of the day, what's the take-home message? It doesn't do you any good not to eat after working out. So there's an advantage. There's a timing factor in terms of metabolism, in terms of muscle uptake from a glycogen standpoint. If you want to have those simpler, fast absorbing, high energy carbs, do them after your workout night right before you go to bed. So I think that there's a timing aspect there. But yeah, I think for me, more than anything, is there's no advantage to waiting. And the only advantage to waiting would be like we were just talking about with the carb restriction studies. And even that, they only did that about 3 days a week. So that's not an everyday thing. And so, pay attention to the needs of what you're doing. And for those just doing weight training, don't overestimate how much you actually did because that workout might not have been quite as demanding as you thought it was. But for my endurance athletes, for the love of God, please eat some carbs too.
Excellent. Once again, Shawn, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Before we sign off, where can people find more information about you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can find me under Shawn Arent, at Shawn Arent on Twitter. And then our center as well, the Center for Health and Human Performance at Rutgers University. We try to post quite a bit of content. Real quick, I want to plug two things. One is, as current president for the International Society of Sport Nutrition, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our national conference is in Las Vegas, June 13th to 15th. We've got a phenomenal speaker lineup shaping up, so please plan on attending. And then we also host the Rutgers Human Performance Conference, March 29th through 30th. Just finalized the speaking program for that, and we have some pretty top people in that one as well. So we're pretty excited. So would love to have you guys engage with us and interact with us, questions, answers, opinions. You can tell me I'm an idiot. I don't really care. Juma, I really appreciate you having me on. I think you do a great service to the industry with what you do. And so on behalf of me, on behalf of my lab, and on behalf of ISSN, thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time. And wow, that Vegas trip in June sounded tempting, to be honest.
It's going to be fun. We got some good ones. Right now, it looks like we've got Eric Rawson and James E. Morton as our two keynotes. They agreed. So I'm pretty psyched about that. And we've even the pre-conference is on sleep, stomach, and stimulants. So we're going to deal with the role of sleep in recovery, the role of the microbiome, and then, how caffeine and other stimulants might factor into the performance factor too. So we got some fun stuff shaping up.
Interesting. I might show up.
You should. I will make sure you have some podcast opportunities to talk to some people and get them lined up for the year.
Yeah. I should probably do that. It sounds. I've been talking to Joey several times, saying that next year I have to come. But every year when the ISSN conference is, I either am traveling or I'm lecturing here in Norway. So it's a bit difficult. But I promised Joey that I would try coming this year. So maybe we'll see each other.
If you can fit it in, we would love to have you.
Yeah. I'll definitely try. Okay.
That's all we can ask.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Shawn. Thank you once again for your time, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Take care, buddy.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.